Okay. Are we on?
Yeah.
Okay. It's August 2nd. We're at the home of Tony Barrand in Brattleboro, Vermont. We are talking today about various Morris topics, including big questions like, why do they call it an ale, for instance? Maybe we'll talk about that. Susan Creighton and I are here today on behalf of the Marlboro Morris Ale Committee. We're creating an archive of the ale as it approaches its 50th anniversary. All right, let's go. I think, rather than, do dates and names and stuff like that, which we already have from Andra and from Julie, let's talk about what you want to talk about related to the ale.
Well, it must have been 1975, and I think I went to Pinewoods first in 74.
Mm-hmm.
And discovered Arthur Cornelius and some people who had been teaching something for a number of years at Pinewoods. And in one of the evening dances, there was a group of men who turned out, I think, later to be the Greenwich Morris men, with Jim Morrison, who was then the director of the society.
Yeah.
And he was one of the men. I mean, he may have been playing fiddle at that time, but he had definitely taught the group. And I had to do it. I saw Morris dancing, and it was a group of... I'm a former rugby player. Oh. And so here were these strong men doing physically demanding things, jumping up in the air and being graceful in their dancing. And I discovered, when I started asking people about it, that it had something to do with time and place, and it mattered where you were doing it, and it mattered when you were doing it. And in addition to that, it was men were doing the dancing, which was remarkable to me. And it was attractive to me as I suppose what Americans would call a jock. But I was a rugby player, and the dancing looked challenging, physically challenging. And I'm going to flip forward to a piece of this story which I think connects, but didn't happen for a few more years. And it was that I was in England visiting in 1979 some English Morris teams, one of which was the Headington Quarry Morris men, who, we knew about Mr. Sharp, You can't go to Pinewoods and not hear the name Cecil Sharp.
Right.
And so these were the men that had been taught by either by William Kimber or by people that he had taught to do dancing.
Can you say again who William Kimber was?
So I slipped in a important name there without saying who he was. Mr. Sharp's first musician for Morris dancing was a man called William Kimber of a Cotswold village called Headington Quarry, because it was a quarry and a lot of stone used for the building of Oxford University buildings came from the quarry in Headington. And a lot of, basically, that was the work in the village.
Miners.
They were quarry workers.
Quarry workers.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you can still see a lot of that stone there, and throughout Oxford they use stone from the quarry. Anyway, I, being an academic, needed to know everything about the Morris dancing, so I got the names from, and here's another name I'm going to give you, Roy Dommett, who you can look at elsewhere on the CDSS website, because that wonderful society has really allowed me to publish all of Roy Dommett's papers. Anyway, one of the teams that I went to visit on my on a field trip that I did into England in 1979 was to go and visit the current Headington Quarry Morris men. And what was interesting to me, watching them dance, they all looked like arm wrestlers. They had strong arm movements, waving handkerchiefs, and it's like, whoa, look at this. So this phrase came to me that this was power and grace. So this strange combination that was visible with these men who looked like they were arm wrestlers, and yet they were waving handkerchiefs in a graceful fashion that was also strong and powerful. And it's like, whoa, where else are you going to see that? So that was astonishing to me. There it was. And so I'm also a perception psychologist. That's my formal academic training.
Yeah.
And that's what I studied in graduate school. And that's what I went on to teach. So for me, there was I needed to explain why they looked like that. Why did they look strong and graceful and powerful, and all of that was there? So that became what I had to do, with the rest of my academic career. Anyway, and I've forgotten where I started into this story.
We were at Pinewoods.
Oh, I was at Pinewoods, so then I saw a group of men dancing, and that was the first time I saw it, which is always amusing to me that I'm English, but I had never seen Morris dancing in England. So here was this fascinating thing with these men who had learned to dance, and the physicality of the dancing came through, but also with the seeming grace that came up with it,
Right.
which was a remarkable combination for me. So tell me again how we got onto that. Oh, I was at Pinewoods.
Yeah, you were
There were
starting
the
at the
Pinewoods.
beginning of...
And so, anyway, it was something I had to do.
Right.
So I was at Pinewoods Camp, and here was I, this Englishman, never seen this at all in England, and here I was catching it at this Pinewoods Camp.
So was John Roberts there as well at that time? I remember
Probably had to be, because we did everything together.
That's what I thought. There's a photograph of you, a very famous photograph of you and John and Jenny Scheimer.
Yeah.
And she's sort of like, like a mother with her hands on her hips and, well, I don't know, kind of look on her face. And the two of you are dressed as, young men of the time with stripes. And maybe even stripes going the other way. I remember those pants from John. Yeah.
And I remember my striped shirt. Yeah, so stripes were in at the time.
Yeah, I know. What can I say? They still are. Yeah.
But these were big, broad stripes.
No, they were very flashy. So the two of you were, I guess, co-teaching at Marlboro College.
Yes.
And you were also experiencing Morris dancing for the first time.
Yeah. And for me, as I said, as a perception psychologist, it became what I had to do. I had already realized that I had something as a singer that I had to try and explain for myself as in the field of perception how it is to tell a story with a song. And it's like, how does that happen? And why are people better at it than others? And so it was not just the singing that I had to explain that we were both involved with, but it was also the dancing.
And you saw the power, and you saw the grace, and you saw men who are often loath to dance. You saw them dancing, right?
Yeah.
Was there a story going along with the dancing?
Well, that's where I got to eventually.
Oh, you did?
was because there are 4 words in the phrase that I got involved with. So power and grace I've got, but as I got involved in trying to understand it more, I had to get time and place. So people danced like the time of who they were at the time, and they danced according to their place, i.e. where they grew up and where they were actually dancing, because it was clear that the dancing belonged to a particular village in England or a town, as it turned out. There were all kinds of aspects to the story that I got involved with. So, time and place, power and grace. So it was like, what a great story. This is complicated to try and explain why people move the way they do and why they dance the way they do and sing the way they do. So that was what my academic career turned out to be about.
That's so fascinating.
So I had to, and it was fascinating. And it's like, whoa, I don't know whether I can ever explain any of that. But I didn't really like explanations as much as I liked the questions. And the questions were so exciting to me that to try and understand why they look the way they do, you need to know how they grew up, what songs were involved, what work did everybody do around them, what was the place and the time, what was it about.
Mm-hmm.
So there was plenty to do trying to figure that out.
Oh my gosh.
Hello.
Can I ask a question?
That's what she
Please
does.
do, my dear.
So this is reminding me of parts of things that Andy was talking about in her interview, that initially there was no image of Morris in the U.S.
Right.
And so the 4 of you that were kind of founding the ale, part of what was behind that, in her words, was trying to put out there an image of what Morris could be, kind of at its best.
Well,
Is that, how do you, would you
Yeah.
speak to that at all?
I can
Yeah.
speak to that. That was the whole point of gathering different groups of people doing it together. It clearly was something that had to happen in a place and in a time. So people were going to bring who they were and their bodies and how they move, doing work, especially, for example. What kind of work they did. It's like, well, here were these quarry workers who were doing this wonderfully smooth kind of dancing that had been seen by Mr. Sharp, and clearly there was something attractive about the dancing, not just that there were men doing it, but the sort of qualities that I saw when I first saw it at Pinewoods, and then saw when I went to visit these teams on their on their home grounds doing practicing, and saw how they ended up dancing. And so that it was visually very attractive as well as physically attractive. So it was to me it was there was clearly an aesthetic that was involved in it. So, and I saw that this wasn't just going to be something that would happen in classes, and so people had to see each other dancing and inspire each other to do dancing. And so the first thing that happened after we got the team started here is it was clearly something that had to happen where we were living. And so given that at that time Andy and I were in Marlboro, so we had to have something going on in the town, in the place where we were living. That was and in order to get a sense of the time as well as the place in which we were living, we needed to get a bunch of people together that in learning this, we needed to get to see other people dancing. So there needed to be a gathering of some sort together. And so that's also why it happened. In 1976, the first Morris Ale, I think, happened, because in 1975, Andy and I had got married and had brought teams together, and so I gathered a bunch of men together that I had seen at Greenwich and that I had danced with at Pinewoods, among. And also, that first year that I was at Pinewoods, not only saw the men dancing, but a group called Ring of Bells, who were women from New York City, had started their team at the same time. So at our wedding, not only I got a bunch of men that I knew from Pinewoods together to be part of the dancing, but invited Ring of Bells. So there was no, and in some ways, in funny ways, and this may come up if you ever interview. You unfortunately can't interview Jody McGeehan.
Right.
But this was a wonderful thing, having another group there to see dancing and how they operated as a team. And it was like, okay. And yeah, I know what I was going to say. In some ways, I think Ring of Bells still think of almost the first Morris Ale really as being at the wedding, because that was when teams in this country first got together. Other teams from different towns and cities had showed up to dance together, And so that was the first occasion for that. So, and that was, to me, so exciting. That's why I had to do the next thing. And so that tried to repeat it the same year. And then I had discovered that here in Windham County and in Marlboro specifically, there was an event that went on locally in the town on the first weekend going into summer, or at the end of, or Memorial Day weekend, at the end of May, and that was clearly a time to do some gathering of people together, because there was a local history of gathering together on Memorial Day weekend.
That was your time.
That was the time.
Place.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That was the time, and the place was because of where we were living. So anyway, so that was the time, and we had the place, and we clearly needed the team starting together. And because it was clear, looking at what had happened for the growth of teams in England, that the men in England really had some bizarre way of thinking about whether women should do it at all. And because the first event had a women's team and a men's team at it, that's what we did. And because CDSS through Pinewoods, women were just as much a part of the growth of the dancing that was happening, at least through camp. And CDSS camp was where we all learned.
Right.
So it was like, okay, that's just the way it is. And so, and then because Andy and I were involved together in getting groups together, it was going to be men's teams and women's teams. That's simply the way it was.
So, in effect, you were creating a new tradition in a new place, which included women and men. This was the American story of Morris.
Yeah.
Basically. And it reflected who you were.
But that's how we dance and how we sing.
Right.
You can only be who you are. And so that's what we did.
You didn't have to be constrained, or you chose not to be constrained by what was happening in England.
Well, it wasn't relevant. I mean, it was a lot of Americans, when they first started, it was like they needed approval from English Morris dancers. But given that they'd taken off in this bizarre track of rejecting having women doing it, in this country clearly wasn't relevant, because women had been doing the teaching and the playing, and
Right.
I've always been fascinated by what feels to me like the tug of war between the urge to Morris dance for the purpose of keeping a tradition alive and sort of being part of the history, valuing the history of it and the connection to what's come before and what led to this form of dancing. And the urge to Morris dance just for the love of dancing, and people going ahead and changing traditions and inventing new traditions. And I mean, I suppose that's all part of the development of a tradition. But for those for whom the history is very, very important, I've seen some resistance to change.
Right.
And there are those who feel strongly about maintaining the tradition, and those who say it's its own dance form, it's a living dance form, it's going to evolve, it's going to take on its own.
Okay, for me,
place.
what needs to be answered there, though, when you do it, is what do you mean by the tradition? Who defines what the tradition is? Since in early days, women were completely a part of the Morris dancing, because Mr. Sharp got it that way. He could get people to dance because the women could do it. And very early on in his teaching the dancing at the school that he started for teaching Morris dancing, women, there were women's teams, women doing it as much as there were men. And it was like, so it seemed bizarre to me if people would bring something out of the history of doing it in England into America. And like, do we need that? No, because that isn't going to fit here.
It's a different place and time.
It was a different place and time, and as much for me also being a jock, that I had women didn't play rugby in England. That was something that American colleges started. So that was happening here. I mean, they were running around smashing their bodies into each other. Why shouldn't they be Morris dancing?
Field hockey. WAP.
Well,
Right.
well, I remember we had to, the school where I was taught rugby and learned to do rugby, the fiercest games we ever played were against the women's hockey team. And they were skilled using hockey sticks. And so we rugby players were amateurs at using hockey sticks. And the women were just good at it. So it was always a physically violent encounter.
Oh my God. I quickly refused to play field hockey when I was young because I was not aggressive enough. I just got hit.
Yeah.
Trying to run away from the sticks.
Yeah. Yeah.
So you mentioned when we were just starting to speak, you were curious why they call it an ale.
Ah.
What have you decided?
Well, in being an academic, doing whatever reading I could about the Morris and about the Cotswolds. Well, I grew up on the edge of the Cotswolds. The town in which I lived, you have to excuse the name of the town here because a lot of Americans just find it funny. Bletchley, which is just on the north edge of the north and west edge of, not west, east, certainly. I still get confused over east and west because England, we look downhill on Europe, and so I get my right and left confused in terms of east and west. So depending on where I'm standing, if I'm in England, west, it feels funny to have west on my right hand.
Yes. So talking about ale.
Thank you.
Ale.
Well, so what I encountered was, as a part of the Cotswolds, which I knew from basically growing up on the edge of the Cotswolds, was that they called in the Cotswolds a country village event an ale, as in a similar way to what in Europe, where they would grow a vintage of wine for a particular year or for a festival, that in the Cotswolds country practice was that you could have a local event in which you brewed an ale. And so the event, so you could have a church ale. It could be, didn't matter what it was. And so an ale was simply an announcement of some event happening with some focus around it. So it could be the church ale. And interestingly about that, is that basically the safe liquid to drink was an ale. So children consumed ale as a safe liquid to drink because water wasn't safe to drink. So ale was something basically that everybody drank. It was a safe liquid.
As in France or any other wine-producing region would have children drinking the wine.
Yeah, exactly that. And it was interesting to me that the English did that with ale. The children drank an ale. So having an event, a local event, like a local feast, at which you brewed a special ale, which you would then sell at the event.
Right.
And it happened, as I said, with churches, with any kind of wood. And the most famous of which was a lamb ale in the Cotswolds at a village called Kirtlington, which was a Morris village, in which the event was about the unmarried women running and catching a lamb. And they were this physically demanding. They would actually have to go running after and catch lambs, which you can imagine the lambs didn't especially like. So they were running from them. So the Kirtlington Lamb Ale was famous, and so that was that was an ale, of course, and they brewed an ale to have and sell at the lamb ale.
I can just imagine this somewhat raucous event.
Oh, great! And I love this thing. You can have in. It was. It'd be a matter of a thing to boast about that you actually caught the lamb. So the.
Was it significant that it was unmarried women? Like if you
Yes.
caught the lamb, you were going to get
Yeah.
married in the next year or something?
Sort of like that.
Oh, gosh.
Yeah. And they were the women a woman who caught the lamb, as a social status.
Right.
You didn't have to do it.
Okay.
Pat, it's okay.
Okay.
It makes me think of American traditions of chasing greased pigs.
Oh, same thing?
Yeah. This
Wow.
chase and catch a farm animal that's hard to catch.
Yeah.
And where does that happen?
Oh. Throughout the South?
I want to say in the South. But I
Yeah,
know
it's
I
exactly
spoke
the
so
same thing.
I was going to say, because Susan is from Iowa, whether that happened where you grew up.
My parents were from Iowa.
Your parents were from Iowa.
I'm not from
But you never heard about that from them.
there. No.
Okay.
Now I'm going to have to go home and look it up.
Pig ale. The Iowa pig ale.
Iowa pig ale.
The big pig ale.
The big pig
The
ale.
big ale, right. That's
my
so
goodness.
interesting, because ale to me then also suggests it's for all ages. Sort of a town event to which everyone is welcome.
That's exactly right. Because that was it was there for everybody to drink.
Mm-hmm.
So, like, you'd sell lemonade.
Yeah. It was not an adults only event.
Was not an adults only
It was the
event.
whole community.
Yeah.
Wow.
So I loved that idea of calling something an ale because it was a local event.
And the brewing part of the ale was not part of the North American event ever.
No.
No.
No, I'm sort of thinking about that recently. It had become not an American thing to have ale as something that was a part of an all-community family event. I mean, basically that was ruined by
Like the Bush brothers or something, or the...
oh, well, I was... No, I'm Prohibition.
Oh,
Mm-hmm.
right.
Yes.
The word I'm wanting
Yeah.
to think of.
Right.
Right.
It didn't make it into this country.
Yeah, and also, the sense of having a local brewery, that didn't happen because it was happening in a much more corporate way, you know.
Yeah, right.
You know, like Anheuser-Busch, or you would get your ale from over there. You didn't have to produce it on your own. Eventually, that's what happened.
Yeah.
And it's only in, the last 30 years that, local breweries are a thing
coming back
again. So in the North American tradition, you have the word ale, but it's not associated with a drink, with that drink, and
and it was different from beer, which is a different product. I mean, it's made differently, and the two words beer and ale, for example, an ale was a word and a drink associated with country living. Beer became associated with the city. And that was true in England. London, you would drink beer.
No kidding.
In the Cotswolds, you would drink ale, because that was what the way it was produced, which on a much more local basis, and anybody could make ale, whereas I think beer fairly quickly became something that could be commercialized.
Right. Oh, there's so many questions about, creating a tradition, in a totally different country, adopting certain aspects of a historical activity from a whole other culture and bringing it to this new country. The English...
Well, with the Puritans and the way of how this country started.
Right.
Because it was...
There was no dancing.
Well, the dancing and drinking. It was made separate.
Go ahead, Susan.
So, I'm really intrigued by your phrase, power, grace, time, and place. It's getting me to think about Morris differently.
Right.
And my question about the history, I think your point is well taken. Like, whose history? Who's defining it? But that's making me think that there is at least, you talked about an aesthetic of Morris that you were trying to capture. Power and grace being part of that. Are there other elements of the aesthetic that you would describe that you felt were really important to capturing what Morris was?
Well, that was using the power and grace, time and place thing really reinforced for me when we were getting started that not only it came from the sort of mixture that happened at our wedding, but then it naturally happened the next year when we first put together an ale. And it's an aspect of that that's very interesting to me. Everybody naturally picked up on calling a Morris gathering an ale. there is the Midwest ale, there is a West Coast ale, so
The Canadian ales, right? The London ale,
everybody,
Toronto ale.
that's what it is. A gathering of Morris dancers is now an ale.
Yeah.
And it's fascinating to me, doesn't get used in England that way.
Wow.
Like the Morris Ring events, nobody ever called it an ale.
What word do they use?
A ring meeting.
That sounds so much less fun.
Well, I think in England, part of what is important to recognize, given the antagonistic attitude towards having women, some of that, the wives of the Morris dancers were supportive of that way of thinking about event, because they didn't want to have their husbands going off to gatherings, with single women available. And so I think right from the early days, women being involved in it, it was supported by the other women who were involved in it, including the wives, especially the wives. Didn't want young single women showing up at these things.
And very attractively dancing.
Very attractive. Yeah, showing off their bodies.
Yeah.
Dancing.
Yeah. And needless to say, that is what happened here. I mean, the social aspect of the ale, the social aspect of young people who were totally committed to this beautiful dancing, being together, it was incredibly interesting to both the men and the women to get to know one another then. How many people met their spouses, right? Those wives were right.
Well,
in a funny
wives
way.
usually are, aren't they?
Words of a
I
wise
mean, that's
It's your story and you're sticking to it.
I'm sticking to it.
well, and you learn it right away.
Yes, you do.
Well,
the wise husbands do.
If they're smart, they do.
That's right.
as women, we just
Right.
know we're always right. I mean, that's
Well,
just
completely.
yeah.
So, Canadian teams have been part of the ale for a long time.
Yes.
Do you know when they started becoming part of what was happening at
In
the
Marlboro.
ale? Yeah, in Marlboro.
Who were the contacts there?
Yeah. How did they get connected to the ale? Would they have been teams that somebody saw dance somewhere and say, "Hey, let's invite them," or were there
Well, there are
connections?
there are Canadian folk clubs that
Right.
were very British oriented. And so those folk clubs, I'm thinking in Toronto of
Right.
in particularly,
Fiddler's Green or
particularly I was thinking of Fiddler's Green,
right.
is that they did everything that went along with being British. And so they had a Fiddler's Green.
Yeah.
There were in Toronto. And behaved like American women, I think, who, rather than like British women, with regard to their menfolk.
I have, I grew up in Toronto.
Yeah.
Went to the university there and first went to Fiddler's Green sometime in 1972. And subsequent to that, met and interviewed a few years ago what's Tam's?
Kearney.
Tam Kearney.
Margot Kearney.
Margot.
And so her story of being a woman within the Fiddler's Green men's singing community and dancing community was quite eye-opening. Getting her side of the story, which was not so public, her role in all of that, which was created around the singing, the dancing, and all the, recording and traveling and,
Well, and it was Fiddler's Green early on. It's dominated by men.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, it was really a men's thing to begin with.
Right. So there was they weren't even, I was going to say Ian Robb and Alistair Brown, but they weren't in Toronto even.
No, in London.
They were in London. So it was Tam Kearney and Alistair, the other singer. Anyway, tangential in a way, but those are the people that would have known about, or maybe you reached out to.
Well,
in
because
Toronto.
John and I sang
That's why.
early on at Fiddler's Green.
That's why. Okay. Then
Yeah,
that's
it's making me wonder if the Canadian folk revival is sort of happening at the same time the American is. Because I'm thinking Doug first saw Morris dancing when he was 18 or 19, so 78, 79, and he very shortly joined Green Fiddle Morris, some of which then splintered off and became the Toronto Morris Men, so they were born
Right, because they
1980
actually...
or so.
Which was an aesthetic decision, by the way.
Yes, yes, it was.
so. Where did he see them?
Well, I'm trying to remember whether he saw them in Toronto or whether he saw them at a annual summer music festival up in Owen Sound.
Okay.
Which is what I want to say, but I'm not sure if that's
And so
correct.
we're talking about Doug Creighton
Yeah?
here, who's a
Right.
dancer and musician,
Right.
and Susan's husband.
And so he would have seen Morris dancing in Canada in the late 70s.
Right.
And it sounds like it was also then catching on. And I don't know if Morris had been alive and well in Canada before then, or if it was
No.
also sort of being revived around the same time.
I think it happened about the same time
Okay.
as as like an infection.
Yeah. right. The Morris pandemic.
Like a fungus.
Right.
I hope an image other than fungus
Okay, let's.
Yes.
Okay.
would probably be good.
Okay. Well, we'll work on that. Come up with a
Really.
different word.
Well, nowadays you could probably use virus because it would be active like that.
Everybody
right.
would have a picture in their head, wouldn't they?
Everybody would.
Yeah.
There was just enough cross-pollination, it sounds like, between Toronto, New York, Boston.
Yeah.
And the singing, you and John singing and traveling and telling stories and bringing, obviously when you visit another place, you're talking about what is important to you. And at this time, your research, Morris and music was important to you.
It was everything.
So you're the vector You know, is that the right word? I don't know. You're the pollinator. There you go. Or maybe you're the honeybee. I don't know.
No, well, John might have been the honeybee. That was a little too accurate, you mean?
Yes, I know. Oh my goodness. We're going to have to edit this.
I think isn't that something that narrators automatically does?
A little bit.
Yes. A little bit, yes. Right.
Tony, how are you doing? Are you...
We are just at about an hour here that we've been chatting. Yeah.
Wow, that's amazing. Well, it's interesting.
Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it? I mean, as you bring up all of these connections that you felt at that time, how alive it was in your mind academically, you know, which would not have been the perception of everyone else. And yet you were trying to... That was your motivating force.
Yeah.
And by having that intellectual motivating force, you were spreading an activity which was not necessarily having that same force in anyone else.
But people were getting the bug.
They were,
as we put it.
Well,
they were getting the vibe.
That's
They were
because
getting
of
excited.
the Morris dancing itself.
Yeah.
I mean, it affected other people like it affected me.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I mean, it was something I had to do.
And yeah, like the first time I heard English dance music, it was like,
Oh!
what do you do to that music? To me, it was how do you move to that music? Because I heard it without ever having seen
Yeah.
an English dance. So, what is that music? How does that ask you to move? Right?
You see,
That's
that's
the
a good
question.
perceptual question.
That's the question.
That is.
And
It's
that
exactly
that was my question.
Yeah. That's exactly the same sort of question that inspired me.
Mind meld.
Mind meld.
So, do you have time for just a couple more questions?
I do.
You do? Okay, good. I have a couple.
Are we
Both
okay
of
on
which will
time?
Take us on different tangents. Yeah, we're fine. As long as you're still good to talk.
I am.
Okay.
Try and stop me.
So I have two questions. You can start on either one of them. They're completely different. One question I wondered about is, it's really interesting to me to hear that you were a perceptual psychologist in particular, knowing that you're bringing that filter to seeing this Morris dancing thing happen. And have you ever written and published about sort of a perceptual psychologist's take on this type of dance?
Well, I think there's quite a lot in my Six Fools and a Dancer
Oh, okay. Okay.
book.
That has that filter, that
Well,
perspective.
The way what I tried to write in the book was, here we be, masters, 6 fools and 1 dancer. It is in itself an amazing perceptual statement. You know, the wonderful use of bringing the word fool in as an inversion of what most people thought it meant. or continue to think it now mean. And this country has had a hard time making good fools for the Morris.
Yes. Yes.
And it's not just been the Morris dancers that have had a hard time with fooling, but it's very much part of an English way of being, I think.
What do you mean by that?
Well, I think of I'm trying to find an easy way of talking about what in England we call pantomime.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Everybody in England grows up with, at Christmas, one of the entertainments that people do at Christmas is go to what they call a panto, which was a pantomime, in which there are some characters, and this is part of what, for me, explains why fooling is a part of what is of English life that isn't part of American life. There's always, in a pantomime, the active hero is a young woman, but not a heroine. She is actually in the plays, playing the character of a young male, but played by an attractive young woman. Always like Julie Andrews, for example, was the first sort of act.
With her short hair.
What's the word we call it when? So here's this attractive young woman who is playing the sort of young male lead.
Are you thinking of Victoria, that movie? Or Julie Andrews?
Well, I think it's connected.
Yeah. I'm thinking of how young women have always played Peter Pan on Broadway, like Kathy Rigby playing Peter Pan.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly like that.
Mary Martin.
Yeah, right. Also playing Peter Pan.
And her, meaning his mother, is always played by a male character. The sort of hit comedian of the time. So whoever the sort of big comic, the sort of the famous funny man of the time in the country would play the mother of this young man who is a woman.
Is that what inspired your mother character?
Yes.
Oh, it's a panto character.
It's a panto character.
Oh, that's great.
Well, that was obvious to me.
Just just the connections I'm making. It all makes more sense.
Right,
now.
and
Okay.
I'm you know, playing one of the characters in an abbot's, you know, like
Abbott
I'm the
and
little
Costello.
boy with the,
The triangle.
because I fit into the
With an
costume or something, you
Oh,
know,
yeah.
like, and I have no idea why I'm doing what I'm doing. Someone just tells me, and there's someone in the man in the woman's clothing, and there's the, you know,
bow and arrow. Yeah.
and they're all those characters.
Yeah. It's a panto.
So
And everybody in England
we'll know
would
it.
recognize it as
Yes.
a panto.
Yes. And
And are
here,
pantos kind of an audience participation
Oh,
thing? Where
yes.
you're-
Oh,
you're kind of
a
yelling
lot
things
of back and forth and
because
heckling, right?
Oh, yeah.
Oh.
or cheering or booing. Or,
And so a lot of these cultural things, you know, are here in, you know, the kind of audience member you are for a Morris team sometimes, you know, or the way you react to what the fool is doing. And you learn that by watching other audience members or the members of the other Morris teams. You learn how to react and you learn how to take part in that.
Because you have a role.
You have a role as an audience member.
and a really good fool tells you what you're supposed to do as an audience member.
Yeah.
Helps guide
Awesome.
you. Yeah.
Yeah.
But how do you make that up if
Yeah.
it's not something that you acquire
Right.
from seeing that kind of theater?
You have no context for
You
it.
have no context.
Right.
Are
It wa-
lovers plays trying to mimic pantos, or are they a different thing? Because I'm
Different
seeing
thing,
lots
I
of
think.
parallels. Huh.
Well, there are parallels, I think, because
Wow.
What a different thing. So that gives more of an English cultural context for fooling,
yes.
which Americans just don't have, and so kind of scratch their heads going,
Okay, well, everyone else is
Cool.
doing this. I'll take part. It looks like more fun if I take part.
and a
Right.
really good fool needs to be one of the better dancers.
Well, there we go,
true?
you see. That's, for
Is
me,
that true? No.
yes. Because the 6 fools and 1 dancer is that, to me, to explain why that phrase is important and is almost for the whole of Morris dancing for me, you have to understand why he would talk about the dancers as fools and himself, the fool, as the one dancer.
Oh.
That to me is what my book was trying to be about. Was
I see. I was thinking more in terms of a fool needs to be able to move well in and out of the set without disrupting and hurting anybody in the
so
process.
needs to be the best dancer.
Needs to really understand
And-
the dancing well.
Yeah.
But I think yours is going much deeper than that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Gosh, this is interesting.
Wow. All right, I have one more question.
Okay.
In a totally different direction here. You've been coming to the ale for many years and videoing and sort of capturing, archiving, logging what's happening. In all the years you've been part of this, how have you seen it evolve?
Whoa.
What are some big things that stand out for you for how it's different now than when it began?
Well, one thing that is I think, a very modern American thing, talking about time and place, is how important children have been in the dancing, and to some extent it has to do with Tom Croskell.
Yes.
But Tom that it was an aesthetic thing, that for Tom, if children were going to do it, they had to do it well. They had to dance well. So it was not just going to be a children's Morris. They had to do Morris. They had to, the physical part had to, and his children's teams have always been fools. So they've always been able to be fools as well as dancers. But anybody going to fool in Morris had also to be a dancer, had really to be a good dancer. And I love that conjunction of the fool and the dancer.
You're also making me think of 1996. Longwood rapper goes to England.
Wow.
Thanks to Rhett.
Yeah.
Dances in big sword festival that's hosted largely by the Gothland Plowstots.
Yeah.
And we hung out with them for a bit and kind of got to know them as a team. And there was the men's side and there was the boys' side.
Yeah.
And they were just learning the dance. And when Gothland came to the Ale some years later, lo and behold, this little guy I remember as a 7-year-old is now a strapping 20-something who's a major member of the men's team. And I thought, if it's your village and your people doing it, then there was that natural way to learn it.
And you...
In the U.S., we didn't have that.
Yeah.
And Tom created a way for kids to
Right.
have that pipeline to Morris.
Yeah.
Super important.
Oh my God, yeah. We don't have...
Any other things that come to mind for you about ways in which the ale, you've seen the ale evolve?
Oh, I know one thing I did want to talk about that was involved when the ale first started. There were two time and place things that didn't fit with it being an American time and place, which was I'm needing Pat to remind me what I was saying here, but she didn't know what I was going to say.
Yeah.
Early on at the start of the ale, two American things.
Oh, I know.
about time and
One
place.
was that I tried to pick up on what I, as an Englishman, didn't actually understand was that having a pig roast was not something that was going to be welcome at the ale. The very first year, we tried to we did roast a pig, actually, but that was at the time when there was an emerging, completely different, I suppose, aesthetic about food. Was that
Right.
it was offensive to a lot of. There were Morris dancers clearly who associated Morris dancing with a whole way of being that didn't include pig meat.
Yes. Yeah.
So there was a joke around the Marlboro team that what we needed to do was, that what we could do next year was, roasted turnip or something.
That's right.
Okay.
Roast some kale.
Right. But kale wasn't yet part of the whole thing.
Right. Okay.
No, but that's definitely it.
Yeah.
That would be part of the joke now. It's gone to something. Kale now becomes the thing that you should. It would be a joke to roast.
Right.
So you said there were two things.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Pig roast,
The pig roast.
which I think of as a very southern U.S. thing. The southern U.S. might not have blinked twice at that.
Oh, it depends where you are and who your friends are, because Phil Watson, one of our good friends, definitely roasts pigs.
Interesting.
He's unusual.
Yeah, but for a lot of people,
Yeah.
No,
the pig roast was offensive.
yeah, you're right. It was all part of, like, coming from the 60s. Are we vegetarians? Do
Yeah.
we honor animals? All of
Yeah.
that,
Yeah.
which you wouldn't necessarily take into account when you were bringing an English tradition or an English
Right.
cultural
Right.
habit
Yeah.
over.
Well, I think the second thing probably has to do with the video, which was I had Nancy Dedger. I had been given.
8684. Please leave a message.
I had asked for, and then been given.
Hi, Margaret Dale. It's Nancy, and I am calling to tell you that I won't be at your house tomorrow. If you remember that we were all gonna gang up and
Okay. Go ahead.
Okay.
I had anticipated that as part of my way of doing experiments, as it were, would be to create visual images out of the video to see how, in order to sort of develop a way of doing an analysis of what you could see in terms of how it contributed to what was going on. And when we got the job here at Marlboro College, one of my requests was to get given videotape recorder. So I actually had, as part of the equipment of being at Marlboro College, and so it was a natural for me to want to make an archive of what was going on in Morris dancing at the Ale, because one could then actually have available. There was basically very little film of Morris dancing that you could see, so it was hard to create a visual impression of what Morris dancing was. And so, assuming that part of what was going on at the Ale was creating opportunities for people to shape their dancing to be better than it was to have video of what it was like, and then those videos could be used as teaching devices. And how does that relate to the second thing?
Well, I was wondering how you've seen the ale evolve over time, and I guess just with increasing numbers of visual images of Morris available to people, it's been more accessible to a wider range of people.
Were you thinking that was that actually fulfilled? That intention? That people would use?
Oh, I know what the other thing was. That helped. Thank you.
Okay.
The Brits are competitive about everything.
There you go.
So, part of what I intended with creating the Morris Ale was I was hoping to have a competition being part of what was at the Morris Ale. And I was shot down heartily at the very first gathering of squires or whoever, leaders of Morris teams, when we had a meeting at the very first Morris Ale, and I raised that idea. People were horrified at the idea of having a competition. People thought that was... In England, people compete over growing turnips and leeks. Literally, you have people at a local event, people would show up with their prize rabbit, would show, and they'd have a competition. You could, my rabbit could beat out your rabbit at the competition. And just the way I think it'd be okay here to compete over, for example, a flower arrangement.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Everything is open for competition like that in England. And I think you could do it here over a flower arrangement. Even women don't mind being the best, having the best flower arrangement.
Or turnip.
Or turnip.
Or turnip.
So this was something that...
I was expecting that.
Yeah.
And it was shocking to me that Americans... competing was about winning and losing. Particularly about losing. I think people didn't want to have a structure in which, in the structure, you know, that somebody would get to be said they were better than you, which meant you were worse than them. That would be a loss.
So did you manage to let go of that?
I had to.
Yeah.
And I tried to bring it up again, and Andy and Julie may have mentioned this at some point. You know, it was funny you talk about there's been 2 books later, because I'm now on another book of trying to write up my work with Anna Marley teaching me clog dancing.
Cool.
And that needs to happen too. So, and I've got basically a draft of the book done. But because I ran a videotape at all of my meetings with Anna, it clearly has to have, you know, it needs to be somewhere so you can incorporate video.
Right.
So it's going to have to be an online book.
Yes.
Which you can now do.
Yes. So you gave up on the competition you had?
Yes. Once I started with the clog dancing, I tried to have a clog competition, which in England
happens all the time.
All the time.
Yeah.
And with clog dancers, it has a kind of formal structure within it in terms of the number of steps you have to dance, and you have to dance on your toe, or you have to incorporate heel beats, or so you have these things that you can use as competitive items that can be done quantitatively and not just qualitatively. You know, people, for example, used to judges used to compete from under the stage so they could hear the beats more clearly. So you could be, and you, in clog competition, for example, a heel beat has to sound the same as toes clicking together on clogs. So you could hear that and separate those better if you didn't have to watch the person dancing. So the judges at clog dancing competitions were under the stage.
Okay.
But clearly that wasn't going to work here. People really didn't. It's interesting because in southern clogging they do compete.
I was just going to say that.
Yeah.
Or fiddle contests.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, that.
Well, you've got certain things you can specify that have to be done. You have to have a certain kind of tune. You have to
Right.
change from this tune to another kind of tune.
Right.
So you've got items you can do.
Well, this also happens in the Scottish dance and music scene here, which is very, very strongly tied to what is going on in Scotland.
Yeah.
That kind of competition, the fiddle champion, the dancing, and I did it myself with Highland dancing, you know. Well, of course you're working towards a competition. Of course.
Yeah.
So culturally, it may have been just that you are in this place, this particular place in Vermont,
Right.
that it was shut down, that competitive thing. Or maybe it was more widely American.
I think it was like with the stuff with the food, that a competition was something that wasn't consistent with
What was,
what was culturally evolving.
right,
Yeah.
so
Among
true.
those people that were drawn to doing this kind of thing.
It's not part of that,
Yeah.
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah.
Exactly. I think
Can we meet again at some point?
Yes.
Yes.
I was going to say, I think because of what I have to do, I'm going farther north today,
Right.
that we need to
Stop.
stop now. But yes.
Okay, this is Tony Barrand signing off.
This is Roger.
For now.
This is Roger and out signing off.